Good evening, welcome. I'm John. I'm the event director and bookseller at Literati bookstore in downtown Ann Arbor, Michigan. We're pleased to welcome back James Tate Hill to our At Home with Literati series in support of Blind Man's Bluff and in conversation this evening with Leona Godin. Just a quick webinar overview for attendees. The chat is closed, but you can keep the chat window open as I will be dropping links to purchase Blind Man's Bluff from Literati throughout the event. And you can use the Q&A feature on your toolbar to submit questions at any time. And I will ask a selection at the conclusion of the conversation this evening. Live transcription is also available to you on your toolbar. There's a CC icon there. And if you're watching us later on YouTube, there are links to purchase books in the description right below me. You can also subscribe to be apprised of our future events as they become available in recorded format. I'd also like to extend a thank you this evening to our friends at Pro Bono ASL for providing ASL interpretation this evening. Thank you, Selena and Nathan, for being here. As a reminder, you can shop for more books at literatibookstore.com to have shipped to your home anywhere in the United States. And of course, if you live in Southeast Michigan, our doors are open to the public for in-store shopping. Most of all, we'd just like to thank you for your attendance this evening or this morning or this afternoon, depending on where and when in the world you may be joining us. So without further ado, I'll introduce tonight's author and our moderator. James Tate Hill is an editor for Monkey Bicycle and contributing editor at Literary Hub, where he writes a monthly audiobooks column. The Best American Essays has chosen two of his works as notable, and he won the Nielsen Literary Prize for a first novel for Academy Gothic. Born in West Virginia, he lives in Greensboro, North Carolina. And Leona Godin is a writer, performer, educator, and the author of Their Plant Eyes, The Personal and Cultural History of Blindness. Her writing has appeared in the New York Times, Playboy, O Magazine, Catapult, and other print and online publications. Godin holds a PhD in English literature from NYU and has lectured on art, accessibility, disability, and technology at NYU's Tandon School of Engineering, Rice University, and the American Printing House for the Blind, among other venues. Her online magazine, exploring the arts and sciences of smell and taste, Aromatica Poetica, publishes writing and art from around the world. Please join me in welcoming James Tate Hill and Leona Godin into your living rooms.
Hello, thank you, John, and thanks Literati once again for us revisiting, reprising with a difference. We were here back in June, right, JT?
Yes, June 8th.
Oh, you have a good memory. I was just going to go with June.
It's a guess.
Speaking of dates, are we gonna shout out to Mom?
Yeah, As are we doing an access check? I'll begin. And just for anybody interested, you're looking at a 40-something Caucasian male with brown hair in need of a haircut, and a dark shirt that, if I back up a little bit, you might be able to see. I'm not going to risk things with my white earbuds, but I am wearing my Their Plant Eyes t-shirt.
Oh, you are so awesome.
I love this shirt. It's very thin for our North Carolina summers. And
you need a Blind Man's Bluff t-shirt.
I've been told that, and yeah, but I think this one will be my blind book of 2021 t-shirt. But
excellent.
And happy birthday to that was your cue, and then I totally missed it. But today is my mom's birthday, so we promised we would not sing. And as you joked on Facebook, we could easily disprove the myth that blind people are musically gifted by singing.
That would be the only upshot, the only good part of that demonstration.
But happy birthday to my wonderful mother, who has been at all of these things, I'm pretty sure. And she turns, I think, 31 years young today, right?
Oh, yeah. Lovely, lovely. Happy birthday, JT's mom. Who, by the way, she has one of the starring roles in your memoir. and access check for me. I am a white woman of a certain age with long brown hair, and I'm wearing this evil. Speaking of the eye theme, and moms too. I'm wearing this evil eye pendant that my mom gave to me, and I can't quite figure out if it's meant to like give the evil eye to people or ward it off, but either way works for me. And I'm sitting in front of a bookcase with a lot of inaccessible books. Or at our friend's house in New York City in Manhattan, cat and turtle sitting for them. So if you start hearing a very needy cat, I will try to keep her quiet, but you never know. And they're musicians, so there's also a conga drum and a nice brick wall in the background. So.
Yeah, we have white furniture and white walls, if you see anything. So,
well, that would be much better here because there's a very fluffy white cat here that makes everything white and fluffy.
I'm offering a bland description that proves that ocular centrism is overrated.
Excellent. Yes. So, you very generously mentioned in your blurb for Their Plant Eyes that, you wish that you had that book a long time ago. And I have to say that I feel the same way about Blind Man's Bluff.
Thank you.
It's amazing to read something where you feel so much camaraderie and so many things where you felt so alone, for so long. And, and then suddenly like, that was my experience. That was my experience. So we'll talk about some of those, but we'll also talk about some writerly things as well. But just to kind of start with that kind of feeling of aloneness, when we were talking in the space of Their Plant Eyes, we kind of talked about like systemic reasons why people might be feeling like there's a stigma attached to blindness, and so perhaps hiding or attempting to pass for sighted as long as we possibly can. Obviously, that's a big part of your book. That is the bluff. So what do you think, like specifically to you, what were kind of some of the triggers you think for hiding for so long?
Yeah. I mean, the excuse me, the length part, I think, is that once, I mean, it's a ridiculous amount of time, of like 15 years without really changing behavior in a significant way. And I think so much of that became when you become so used to concealing and you don't know how to break the pattern. But in the earliest days, as I say somewhere in the book, it didn't begin as a conscious decision. It just became a way to deny what I noticed happening, which was that people around me, casual friends, acquaintances, I could no longer look for them in the cafeteria, in the library. I didn't know where to sit in classes, and classes where there wasn't assigned seating. And you realize after you're not looking for people, how few people start looking for you. And there was the different tone with which I noticed people, adults, teachers, not my high school teachers, who were wonderful in providing accessibility and creative ways to change what I couldn't do. My anatomy physiology teacher was letting me take my exams not visually, but through palpating skeletons and things like that. And my just wonderful accommodations for my high school teachers, but we met. A very important scene in the book is meeting with the disability counselor at the giant university that I was planning to attend with all my high school friends, West Virginia University. And this older fellow tells us that the best gift I could give my parents in my first semester of college is a report card of straight C's. Ugh. And it just, I had settled into a lazy B average in spite of, higher academic peaks in elementary school and junior high. But as I say in the book, I had given my parents a similar gift not that long ago, and they would have been grateful for the gift receipt to return that gift. But
Right.
just, they were maybe more disgusted, my parents were, than I was. My biggest concern was when he told us that all the blind students stayed at the downtown
Mm.
dorm. And I was like, well, that's not where my friends are applying to live. They're going to stay at the more modern towers on the other side of campus. If I don't have them to glom onto, who am I going to eat with? Who am I going to hang out with? I was like, I might as well go to another school. And so we stopped off at another school, just a random decision. And if I didn't have friends to rely on, then I might as well at least find a place where there was accessibility, and a disability counselor who spoke to me rather than to my parents, as so many people I started noticing would either not acknowledge me being in the small group, or, because you can still tell when you can't see who someone's looking at, you can tell where the voice is directed. And I
Yes.
noticed that voice was not being directed to me nearly as often as it used to be.
Right. And then the flip side is that it's very difficult to quote unquote catch somebody's eye to get that voice directed
Yeah,
towards you as well.
exactly. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, this
So,
seems like a perfect, oh, not to interrupt
no,
you.
go
Sorry.
ahead.
Seems like a perfect moment to actually talk about what you see and what you don't see. Of course, there was, again, this is one of those things that I had never read before, although I had experienced it. Although I'm totally blind now, I used to have vision that was very similar to yours, kind of blind spot right in the center, which is
Mhm.
a bummer if you'd like to read or see faces. But could you actually do two things? One is that, I mean, you describe it so wonderfully in the book, but it seems to me that also the cover kind of gives some indication
Yeah,
of what you saw. So can you kind of describe that and maybe the cover at the same time?
yeah. The blind spots are central, but they're quite expansive, and they extend their tentacles out into the farthest edges of the peripheral vision. So they're not the cover of the book, which is brilliant, and my wife, who's a graphic designer, Lori, when I said, "Do you want to see my book cover?" I had not opened the file yet, and I would like her there to describe it to me. So I opened the file the first time, and she gasped and gotten so many compliments. And the artist, who is Norton's art director, Sarah Mae Wilkinson, who was just
Wow.
so brilliant, played off this description where I referred to it as a sort of time-lapse photo of a galaxy.
Mm.
Although the one thing that she took her own creative interpretation for is that it's sort of an outer space darkness. And as you point out in their plant eyes, blindness rarely means darkness. And so my blind spots are more of a strange mishmash of kaleidoscopic shapes that sort of collide. And there are some shadows and light. And so if I'm close, I can see reasonably. You described this well too, that it's really not that hard to look someone close to the eyes, which is why it's so ridiculous in movies when you see the vacant stare of the blind. But the precision of the vision that remains is very limited. And so I can get by mobility wise without a cane. Although knowing where I am is not as easy as getting there, if that makes any sense.
Mm.
And
So you don't use a white cane, even after all those harrowing street crossing experiences that you detail in the book.
yeah, well, I learned not to take chances was the central lesson.
Gotcha.
And if I were a pedestrian in a more active area, I'm pretty sure I would change those behaviors. But I'm currently, if I were in New York, where the pedestrian difficulty level goes way up, but at the same time the access goes way up too. But yeah, I have enough useful vision that allows just enough to get me in trouble, I guess, is
Mhm.
maybe one way of putting it.
I remember that feeling.
Yeah.
Yeah. Later in the book, just totally jumping ahead, but I kind of want to think about this for 1 minute because it's so interesting. You have a moment where you hear you go to a reading with a disabled poet, um, and you're kind of amazed at how she weaves her experience in with her writing. And I think one of your friends says something like, well, why don't you, JT, write about your disability? Why don't you write about your visual
Yeah.
impairment? And you were like, no. I don't even think you said no, you just completely evaded the
Yeah.
subject. But is this book in any way kind of a coming out of the closet for you at all?
It would be if I hadn't written the novel that sort of partially did that.
Right.
And then it was, the legally blind protagonist, and you've read Academy Gothic, and going back,
It's great.
I might have. Thank you. The I think I would have written that narrator a little differently if I had it to do over again. But I was writing it more for the needs of the narrative and not trying to define my own experience. It was inspired by my own experience, but I think Tate Kalishaw is capable of more physicality than I am, and things that he does are in a few places are not things that I could do. But I realized promoting that book that people are very interested in the parts of novels that sound true, and that was the truest part of the novel, other than the decrepit nature of higher education. And the essays, a couple of essays that I wrote that were, I guess, ostensibly just to help get the word out about Academy Gothic. I found myself writing totally about myself for the first time and sharing like a LitHub essay called "On Being a Writer Who Can't Read," which was an ironic title because it, like the audiobooks essay that I wrote for them that they titled "Do Audiobooks Count as Reading?" Those questions are sort of rhetorical and meant to echo perceptions of others, not my own perception of what reading is or isn't. But I found myself really comfortably settling into my own narrative and realizing that at that point I had achieved a level of self-acceptance, and I did have a narrative arc. Prior to that, when my friend Jenny in graduate school was asking me, why don't you write about this? I was like, there's nothing to write about. It's just, there's no narrative here. There's no ending. It's just obfuscation and lies of omission and occasionally lies of commission, sadly. But yeah, when I wrote that first essay, I likened it to a coming out, because I didn't talk about blindness on social media, and people who only knew me there, like, wow, I never realized. I was like, yeah, I guess that was very much a deliberate choice, and I shouldn't have. But it was still, just part of the pattern that hadn't been broken.
Yeah. Well, going from that, so how I love origin stories of books, right? So how did you go from being, the guy who's not talking about it? I mean, you talked about a little bit of how that happened, but also just how did the book begin to form in your head? When did you decide, I'm going to write a memoir, and then how did that happen?
I had written a couple of other books in between Academy Gothic and Blind Man's Bluff, novels, and I liked them well enough, but I also wasn't entirely sure what they were. They were kind of young adultish, and I probably didn't read enough young adult to even know that I hadn't written young adult novels. And it's just that, I mean, you're working on fiction now, right?
I am.
And you know that weird feeling where some days you're not sure if it's good or just good enough to keep you going. And I think I had written a
Ouch.
couple of, I had written an entire novel that was just good enough for me to think that it was good. And I passed it off to my first readers, and they gave me positive feedback. But at this point, I had started started writing Blind Man's Bluff, and I was maybe 20 pages in, and I realized this is so much truer on every level, not just because it's nonfiction, but because there's an emotional center to it. And the voice, I found that I was able to access some of the same sardonic humor that I enjoyed about writing Academy Gothic that by now I had realized, and what allowed me to write Academy Gothic with a legally blind protagonist was that I viewed my entire charade of trying to pass for sighted as the comic foible that it was. And obviously the Academy Gothic doesn't have the same pathos, but I realized that instead of using humor to deflect, I could finally use it to reveal. And so that was how, once I was, and structurally it went through, many changes, but I knew the essential story right as I started telling it. And, it's just, so much of it was obvious to me over the years. It was just nothing that I could change or nothing that I felt comfortable changing. It was not a skin that I felt capable of slipping into. But by the time I was writing it, I had become somebody who had gotten much more comfortable and was still continuing to get comfortable identifying as blind.
Yeah, I mean, man, there's so much I want to say about that, but I guess my writerly question is, do you think that actually finding that kind of truth in this memoir will somehow kind of help your next novel, or are you already
I think
working
so.
on another one?
Yeah, and maybe it's just theoretical to talk about it like that, but I finished a new novel that my agent's given me some notes on, and I think we're going to talk about it soon. But it's set in the malls of the 80s and 90s, and it features child stars, some real and some fictional, and it's a speculative novel. I don't know if you could get much further from the book that I've just published than this book in terms of its description, but I feel like I've been able to tap into parts of myself, even separate from disability or blindness or that part of my lived experience. But I feel like I've been able now in my fiction. I feel like I've tapped into a place where the ability to call on experience is easily accessed through details that are how to put this, it's not even so much autobiographical details, but I'm able to pull on a lived experience that creates characters, a world that are almost instantly more real than the fiction I used to write. Does that make sense with the fiction you're writing now?
Absolutely. Well, my goodness, I don't know. I think there is something maybe in first attempt. Well, I don't know. Let's not generalize, but I think I feel the same way, where accessing sort of emotionality is something that I am a little wary of. So I can definitely relate there. In fact, one of the scenes that I wanted to talk about was one of the opening scenes. And I think this speaks to that really well, is that, you're kind of arriving at your new wife, but not new girlfriend, but you guys had been living apart for a little while, and things are obviously not going well, to say the least. And you're going to be in this new place that is totally inaccessible, it seems, and kind of quite reliant on her. And so really soon, I think it's the prologue, where you end up in the bathroom I mean, sorry for the spoiler alert, but it's in the prologue, so I
Yeah,
don't feel
yeah.
too guilty, that you end up crying in the bathroom. And it's a really intense moment, I think, because it does come so early, and there's this kind of mix of sort of metaphorical blindness and physical blindness. And I was just curious, you said that the book has taken a lot of different shapes, but was that always kind of the opening scene, or yeah, how did that feel to write that?
Yeah.
Yeah.
It was always in the book, but it was not always the opening scene.
Right.
Yeah, it's so much. I took this overly pretentious or writerly, however you want to shade it, positively or negatively, um, approach to the structure of the book in the first draft, and it was sort of a scrambled narrative, almost like a West Wing episode or Pulp Fiction, and everything was mixed and matched. And I don't know why I didn't realize that would be off-putting to casual readers, i.e., agents or editors. But I thought, well, this is a metaphor for the way that I live through the rim of my peripheral vision. But those metaphors are usually better expressed over a beer rather than over a 250-page draft. And so, I before the final version that I sent my agent, that he agreed to sign me with, it was structurally pretty much the same now in terms of what happens when. There was lots of other changes that came, but the original first chapter was going to be that meeting with the disability counselor, but then it didn't really make sense to go back in time with three or four chapters. And the marriage to Meredith, as I call her, is the
Not her real name, I take it.
the author's notes, but that relationship, because it is such a turning point, I was breaking that into like interstitial pieces throughout the book and just scattering that portion. It was a mess, but all the necessary parts of the story, I think, were more or less there. I was just unnecessarily complicating how I was telling the story.
Well, I wonder then about, because I think there's 3 chapters that are second person narratives. Yeah. So they seem to kind of break up the book into thirds. I mean, look, I'm not good at math or anything related, but it seemed like roughly thirds with the second person chapters. And I'm just curious, is that, I mean, I already had a question about this, like how those came into being, and were they part of the structure from the beginning? And now I'm even more curious about it because you say that.
Yeah. They always were it was always those 3 chapters in second person. And I don't know if I knew instinctively, but the reason why they felt most natural to me, I decided maybe in the second draft, was that those were the times that I felt least connected to a sense of self. And the first one is chapter 1, when I'm just losing my sight. The second one comes post-college, when I'm living in an apartment in a city where I have no friends and I have no idea where I'm going or doing, and I'm alone, literally and figuratively. And then the other one is, spoiler alert, post-divorce, which is the dating chapter, online dating. And so those 3 time periods are the periods where I felt least, and which isn't to say that there are other chapters where I was happy, or other chapters where I wasn't confused, but there were other chapters where I had a wrong sense of who I was, or I was able to define myself even as that definition was erroneous. And so those remain in first person.
Right. Right. Yeah. I felt that. I think that was what I instinctively got, but it's great to hear about it. Moving from the sort of macro writer perspective to the micro, perhaps. I've been trying my hardest to kind of get into Instagram for, like, because I'm a bit of a masochist. But I do still feel like I'm kind of a visual person. So I like creating the pictures, but there's this, the inbox system is really indifferently accessible, but I found this message in there that was apparently attached to a photo when I was really, promoting the book a lot. And it turned out to be a heckler. And it was something like, and said something like, you wrote this book, and then emoji, thinking face rolling eyes, which I take to mean that this person does not know that blind people write. So I thought
Oh,
we
wow.
might just take a pause just for a moment and talk about, your process of writing and also how you think that it is similar to or dissimilar from other writers and editors.
Yeah,
Writing.
and I would love your answer to this as well. I was I'm expanding an essay or expanding a tiny part of the book into an essay right now about the time my high school English teacher decided she would teach one of my short stories that I was showing her in this year that I was adapting to vision loss, and I think she just recognized that I was trying to reach out and communicate somehow by the few things that I could still do, and the way that I found myself as I was getting into audiobooks from the National Library Service. I thought maybe I can write something, and I had these micro cassette recorders, which were ostensibly to record teachers' lectures, but I found that I could more or less remember what I needed to remember, or just certain classes I just didn't care. I certainly wasn't going to go back and re-listen to a biology lecture. And so I use these micro cassette recorders to write to dictate short stories, and I that was how I wrote my first drafts until maybe a year after, maybe a year or two after I had screen reading technology at my disposal. Um, it was just an old habit that was hard to break. And I found that I could visualize entire paragraphs in my head. And I also, at that point, until I had a screen reader, until I had that technology that allowed me to edit, I just didn't know what editing was as a writer. So that was probably not the microcassette method was probably not super conducive to editing, because you can't re-record over unless it's the same length. Like I
Right.
need a 4-second sentence here. So the revision process doesn't work that well, and since I didn't have a screen reader, that didn't work that well. But it really helped me in the days before I had my digital voice and on the computer to get the rhythm right, because I was mimicking the rhythm that I heard in audiobooks. And as you know from the National Library Service, some of those narrators are like the best that have ever lived. And
Yeah.
they were my models for what sentences should sound like. And I think all of us do that with writing anyway. But I think people who read visually are probably translating text into their inner voice. At least that's what I think I remember doing. But I was doing, that literally with my actual voice, and then processing it with my ears and seeing if the rhythm sounded right or the meaning sounded right. What about you?
Yeah, I mean, I went kind of from doing stuff with magnification to doing stuff with screen readers. But then, of course, I was also, listening to books on tape back in the day. It's interesting because I actually I'm so appreciative that audiobooks are so sort of mainstreamed now, and I definitely want to talk some more about audiobooks. But it's funny because I actually prefer the electronic voice
Yeah.
over a narrator. Not necessarily, like I want to do both, you know. I find that sometimes there can be too much interpretation to
Mhm.
me, or it feels like a kind of an interpretation that I don't always want on a first read of something.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah,
I was
it's
talking to our mutual friend Steve Kusisto, and he
uh-huh.
was saying he's become totally a devotee of the electronic voice,
Yeah.
and I get that. Especially I don't think I really embraced the audible or realized to what extent books on tape had become so um, accessible outside of our library
Yeah.
until maybe 5 years ago. And my wife Lori got me a Kindle um, as soon as they had talking menus, which I think was not until 2011 or around that time. And
Huh.
so I was reading with the text to speech on the Kindle all these books that I couldn't get for years and just devouring them. And
Yeah.
what I think happens, and I describe this in the audiobooks chapter, at least how it happens for me is I'm translating that voice into my own voice, or at least what I'm hearing becomes more than the sounds pretty quickly.
Yeah.
And soon the sound becomes words and sentences and story. And you don't realize, any more so than you would recognize font if you're reading visually. After a while, you're just reading. And but I do agree, there are certain narrators and certain experiences where um, it becomes a bit cumbersome. I just read a book that I won't name, but it's one of my favorite writers, and I put it down, and I think I had to reckon with the fact that it was not how I wanted it to sound,
Mm.
and it was taking over my experience in ways that it was also I don't know, it was becoming um, the tone was becoming monolithic. I don't think it was allowing the text to become as fulsome or expansive as it really was.
Uh, yeah, I do remember like in the early days of listening to books on tape because I think we both used, you know, recording for the blind. I mean, they
Yeah.
seem to have really have a lot. Uh, you know, they had so many of our textbooks. They also just seem to have more, um, I don't know, variety. You know, more
Yeah.
books that I maybe edgier, slightly edgier than the Library for the Blind was my
Yeah, pretty
experience when
much
I
if
was a
anything had
kid.
ever been anything that had ever been taught at a college or high school, you'd find it
Exactly.
there.
Yeah, exactly. But I
And they
do
were
remember that.
go ahead.
I'm sorry. There were moments when, because they were all volunteers, that the readers would shift, right,
Yeah, yeah.
in the middle of the book. And I remember that being a very sort of disorienting experience. But as you say, I mean, it's really fast that, you know, when you are used to listening to reading books by ear, um, that your brain just takes over and then they become words again, you know. But there are those
Yeah.
kind of jarring moments when the reader maybe draws too much attention to themselves or
Hmm.
something.
Hmm. Yeah, and I actually likened um, when I was describing this for somebody, the volunteer readers of RFB, um, and it's not like they were bad, but they had a time. They were A, volunteers, and B, they're just trying to get it done and get students the information as quickly as they can.
Mm.
And so there's no art to it. They didn't revel in, the sonic pleasures of Ulysses. Uh, and so in ways they were like human equivalents of the electronic speech. And in ways I found them easier to adapt into my own head. Um, Less overt pleasure, but it's easier
Mm.
to sort of penetrate past the volunteer readers into the brain space where you're just absorbing the info in the text.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, we're already sort of bumping up against our Q&A time, but we have to talk about your audiobook and
Yeah.
the process of that happening. We talked about my harrowing experience of recording my own audiobook, and there was a moment when you you might have done that. But yeah, talk about that experience and how wonderfully it turned out for you.
Yeah, if you've seen me on social media in the past couple of months, definitely you've seen me extolling the virtues of one Curtis Armstrong, the actor from movies like Revenge of the Nerds and shows like Moonlighting and Supernatural. And I just encountered, I didn't know I don't know unless you, usually the audiobook narrators are anonymous actors, and they're exceedingly talented and they're exceedingly good at what they do. But it's not that common for regular actors, unless they Tom Hanks doing Anne Patchett's The Dutch House, or
Didn't even know that.
you'll and so I wouldn't have thought, wow, Curtis Armstrong, I wonder what he's up to. Would he like to narrate an audiobook? But I encountered him narrating this book called Wild and Crazy Guys: How the Comedy Mavericks of the 1980s Changed Hollywood Forever. And I was like, that's Curtis Armstrong. I recognize that voice from Risky Business or Revenge of the Nerds. And I never would have thought we could even reach out. I was listening to this book, reading this book, well before I even had an agent for my memoir. But I sort of tucked that sound in the back of my head of this way that he's delivering the lines, but also serving the text, not acting, but narrating. And also really finding, as a performer, how many ways there are to deliver lines. And so often it is just so important to find the emphasis in a syllable or a single word. And I was just in awe of how he would unlock the emotion in a sentence from a single word. And he totally does that in my book. He also, there's a few scenes that they were almost uncomfortable for me to listen to, because I had been reading my book exclusively with my Jaws screen reader voice for years. And now I hear it in a human voice, and he brings some emotion to a few moments, and it made me really
Did he make you cry? Did he make you cry to you? No.
I'm trying to remember. Part of it was just so surreal that it registered as, oh my God, this is my story, but not just my story, but my emotion. And it was like, oh wait, other people are going to read this. But that was one of those, oh my, this is happening moments. But I was just so thrilled with the work that he did. And he's such a sweet man. He's just so.
You got to talk to him?
Only through Twitter.
Gotcha.
But he has just been nothing but wonderful. And what was the other thing I was going to say about him, or the audio book? I lost my thought, but
I'm sorry, I probably interrupted you. Well, maybe this will jog something, because I really appreciate. I listened to a little bit of it, and I appreciate the fact that he didn't try to do voices, because that is one thing that makes me go nuts when people try and especially do the other gender voices. You just want a good reader.
That was definitely a must. And I remember what I was going to say is that my mom and one other relative said how much like my voice he sounds like. And I'd never even thought of that. But I think we have a similar timbre to our voice. So I've been telling people who have been reading the audiobook that I only know from social media, I'm like, well, that basically sounds like me. So just think of it as
nice. Like, that is exactly how I that is wonderful.
But
and we're gonna
go ahead. I was surprised at his age, and I mean, it's public knowledge. You can look him up on Wikipedia. But I think he's 67 or 68. But he sounds just like he sounded in the 80s. It's amazing.
Yeah. I mean, it's something that I'm a little envious of, I gotta say, because I am still a little pained by my own audiobook recording. And I'm like, what would it have been like to have a professional do it? You know, but
Yeah,
I guess
your
the
book.
grass is always greener.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I I feel like your book, because you were such a guide, um, you were the guide not just through your own life, but you were like the museum guide, giving us the tour through all these stories and all this information. It felt right for you to be doing your own book,
Oh,
and
good.
I mean, you did a great job. So
Oh
I
boy.
understand the desire, but your novel or whatever book comes next, you can play around with the professional narrator then.
Definitely. Yeah, for the novel. And I do feel like, I don't know how you feel about this, but I do feel like I enjoy nonfiction, especially memoirs, that, you know, they can be read by the author or not, as in your case. But I don't I the couple of times that I've heard novels being written by the author, I don't know. Sometimes I feel like they're trying too hard to tell
Yeah,
me what, I don't know. You're so much more of an expert and a connoisseur of audiobooks than I am. But what do you
it
think about?
is. It's exceedingly rare for novelists or fiction writers to narrate their own. One who did a good job, I will recommend Victor Laval's work on The
Ah,
Changeling.
huh.
Um,
Okay.
he does not try to overdo it. He's very steady, um, and he's very good. It's essentially a horror novel, and he's very good with capturing the tone without some fake sense of foreboding. Um, I guess I won't name the ones who I thought were bad,
Yeah.
but
Yeah.
but we're in agreement that it's really hard to narrate a
Hard.
novel well, and I think it's best to leave the professionals. Whereas I think with memoir, like the folks that I talked to for the piece that I quote you in, people who did their own or didn't do their own, it works either way, but you still have to be good, and you have to be really knowledgeable of your own book. And that was where my sense of relief came from when I found out I
Right.
didn't get the job narrating my own book. Was relief, because I was like, oh, I tried so hard to get these emotions right. Now I'm going to have to emote as well, or now I'm going to have to translate or interpret my own sentences. It just felt like another kind of hurdle between me and the reader.
Yeah, that's interesting because I do think that that's what makes it hard, right? I mean, mine is my book is so sort of informational. Um, but yeah, I mean, reading dialogue convincingly and things like that is definitely hard.
Yeah.
And yeah, I can't quite imagine being able to pull that off without having those acting chops. I'm just going to remind people that they have just a couple more minutes, about 5 more minutes to get their questions in if they have any for JT. And then maybe pulling on this whole audiobook thing for one more thread, and that is this idea of reading by ear. And I know that you wrote that piece you had kind of referred to before, that you kind of got some, I guess, kickback from it or something.
Yeah.
Is that also kind of, was that also kind of a coming out of the closet when you started writing the audiobook column to kind of explain to
Yeah.
people?
It was and by then it was already a chapter in the memoir.
Hmm.
And then I sort of adapted a little bit and asked, I sent it to my editor at LitHub, who loved it. And so it ran, and they title all these pieces, and they're excellent at titling the pieces to get people to want to read them. And so the title they came up with is "Do Audiobooks Count as Reading? And Other Pernicious Questions by, I think it was, Visually Impaired Readers." And so the word readers is in the title, but the question was meant to simulate, my own perception of um, doubts that I had experienced and that are not as pervasive as they used to be, but still,
Mm.
they've shared that piece multiple times on social media over the years, and without fail, not that I'm a glutton for punishment, but without fail, if I notice them sharing it, you can look at the comments and just see a bunch of randos who answered, no, nope, sorry. It's just like watching TV, or it's like listening to a
Wow.
radio. It's listening, it's not reading. And nobody has actually read the article, which is the irony.
Uh,
But the it's nobody has thoughtfully engaged the question in those comments, which again, don't read the comments ever anywhere.
mm.
But those are the people who give me reassurance that books like mine and yours need to be written, and that
Yeah.
we've got a ways to go, and the progress. I don't know. I feel like I'm sometimes in a bit of a social media bubble with people who are thoughtful, and people who understand um, empathy, and people who are members of the disability community, of writers and readers, and when I leave that bubble and you see, it's like, oh wait, yeah, there are a lot of people who don't think blind people can write or read, or refuse to relinquish that word read for something that is not precisely what they defined it as in first grade. It's and and that's where this, it's a microcosm for what the stigma is, and where that internalized shame comes from, that we try to avoid by pretending we can see, even if it almost gets us killed or divorced or fill in the
Yeah.
blank.
And it's hard too when it comes from, it's funny because I just read that piece for the first time. I don't know what hole I was dug into that I hadn't run across it before, but you even quote Oliver Sacks, that actually was in my book, that very same quote of him lamenting the fact that, there's no good large print books, which I would agree with, except for there's mine.
Yeah.
But
It's like
but
to Oliver.
but he also just basically says, he makes a very impassioned speech about not believing in, reading by ear. And it's hard because I think there's quite a few really remarkable writers. I mean, Oliver Sacks is kind of one of my heroes, and it was so painful for me to read that. And it's hard, right? That even people that are as thoughtful, never mind the trolls, who are rolling their eyes at us, but even people as thoughtful as Oliver Sacks is maybe not woke to the blind thing, even though he spent some time being.
And similar, I don't know, I think in the book I might have taken out, I think in the book version of that chapter I took out Oliver Sacks and the other named people just to make it feel more essay-like or memoir-like. But in the piece that ran as an article or essay, whatever term you want to use, the Sacks quote is in there. And Sven Bergertz, who was, I don't know if he would, I feel like that the Gutenberg Elegies was written in the mid-90s, and I feel like he would, maybe I'm just being generous to him because we follow each other on Twitter, but I think he's probably a little more open-minded about back then. He said there is, quote, deep reading, but there is no such thing as, quote, deep listening. And I would love to know if he's had a change of heart on that, given the amount of, and I don't think that you go here in your book, and I didn't want to go here. The line I use in the audiobooks essay is I could find arguments, I could find psychological studies that measure brain waves and show that there's comparable activity, but there's no defense like feeling you have nothing to defend. And if you have to argue, then you've already lost the argument of empathy.
Right, because we're sort of on the defensive, right? There's the assumption is that reading by ear is not reading. And so everything else feels like maybe, trying, thou dost protest too much or something. Yeah.
Right.
But you do also quote from a great book. If people are interested in this topic, what is it, the Untold History of the
Of
audiobook or something? Yeah,
I think, yeah, The Untold History of the Talking Book.
the talking book,
I
right?
think it's
Yeah.
Matthew Rubery,
Yeah.
Rubery, which, yeah, that book is just amazing. Yeah, and it's not a manifesto. I mean, he analyzes all sides, and yeah, highly recommend that book.
Me too. And I know we just have like maybe one more minute or something, but I wanted to get your take on this because it's been so wonderful, right? Having our books come out within just a couple of months of each other, and really our friendship coming about because
Yeah.
of that fact. And I'm just wondering if you had any ideas about how we can kind of continue that, right? I've got this hashtag that I'm kind of sometimes using and mostly forget because I'm really bad at social media, but it's Blind Writers Unite, right? And I think for so long we've been kind of like forced into being sort of the solo show or something,
Yeah.
the inspiration porn that kind of rises above the rest or something. But how do you think that we can kind of continue to grow that blind writer community?
Oh, what a good question. Conversations like this one are wonderful, but there's got to be a way to continue the conversation. I mean, you have Aromatica Poetica, which is not per se a blind journal, but just dedicated to the sense of smell. And I wonder what kind of online salon there might be, because it is, and it's, I've one of the great wonderful things is finding other writers, not a lot, but starting to find and have these conversations with other blind writers, and even somebody who is a young writer currently in an MFA, named Nikki Lissy, who's published a couple of things, and she has reached out to me and I've reached out to her, and just that social media has allowed people to find one another. Yeah. But how do we find? What is the lighthouse beacon that maybe we'll think of something.
I think we will. I think we will. This has been so wonderful,
Yeah,
JT. I'm so
you.
glad we got to talk again. And I know our time limit was sort of 5:02, so we kind of ran over a little bit. But I just think that you're absolutely right that we need to have more conversations, because I don't know if you feel this way, but I do feel like there's things that people that have similar experiences can bring out in our books that, as much as we love all readers, right? And I no dissing on the sighted reader, I love them too, but they are going to pick up different things in our books, I think, than our blind pals. So
yeah, and let me say that speaking of sighted readers, I picked up finally my copy of Their Plant Eyes in hardcover from our friends at Literati this afternoon. So it's being shipped to me, and as a tiny token of my gratitude for them hosting us for these two conversations, but also just as a memento to say, hey, this came from Literati. And I, of course, have the audiobook, which is the one I'll consult, but I will gladly loan it out to people and become threatening if they don't return it in a timely fashion.
I have to say that I too bought your hardcover book, and immediately it was stolen by a couple of friends. So I'll be getting it back. But since I've read your book, it's okay.
Well, thank you, James, for purchasing from us.
Absolutely.
So appreciate that. And thank you both for such a wonderful conversation this evening. I've shared a link in the chat if you'd like to check out or perhaps purchase the Untold Story of the Talking Book from Literati Bookstore. There's a link in the chat there. And of course, here's a link one more time for Blind Man's Bluff by James Tate Hill. Thank you so much for joining us this evening. I'm Leona Godin, James Tate Hill at Home with Literati. Thank you again to Selena and Nathan for joining us as
Thank
well
you,
and
Selena and
providing
Nathan.
a
Yes.
wonderful interpretation. And to all of you, thank you so much for joining us. We hope you continue to stay safe and be well, and we look forward to seeing you at the next event. Have a great night, all.
Thanks so
Thank
much,
you.
John.
Thanks,
Thank you,
John.
Leona.
Thank you, JT and Literati and
Take
interpreters.
care, all.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.